Hello, everybody. We're back for the latest episode of Boardroom RevOps, where we're bringing you valuable tips from RevOps experts so you can make it to the C-suite. I'm James, co-founder of Accounting, the RevOps BI platform. Super excited to welcome Jaap Westrik to Boardroom RevOps today. He is the founder of Modern Revenue, which is a growth execution consulting firm, and a former managing director at Winning by Design. Jaap, great to have you on.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for the account aim team as well.
Of course.
Yeah.
Getting to that time of year for annual planning, and so for this episode, we're going to do a breakdown of capacity planning today. Jaap spends a lot of time here. But before we dive right in, Jaap, I shared the briefest bit of your background. Do you want to share in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, sure. No. So yes, as you said, I'm the founder of Modern Revenue, and Modern Revenue is a bit of a niche consulting firm. It's basically I help companies cross-functional line go-to-market and finance on the growth strategy. And specifically, my focus is on helping recurring revenue companies and helping them improve their forecasting accuracy by aligning the CFO, the CRO, but also the CMO and their teams on a common data language, a common data model, and a unified operating plan. And so I have both a finance and a go-to-market background. So I'm kind of like a dual citizen, if you will. And so I spent a bunch of time at JP Morgan in investment banking. And then at Winning by Design, I started actually bringing my finance expertise and finance frameworks to go-to-market consulting, a world that is, generally not particularly, in go-to-market, people generally don't have a finance background. And as I started to do that work, I just gradually started to realize like how fundamentally broken the go-to-market finance relationship is in most companies. And it's usually not a question of like whether alignment is a problem. It's just really kind of like how bad it is. And so this dual skill set helped me or enabled me several years ago to recognize this underserved need in the market to align the go-to-market functions and finance on a common operating lens. And so I would say that one aspect of my own background is being a bit of a lateral mover, which really set me up, I think, for identifying this cross-functional problem. I was a foreign policy major, then banking, then now go-to-market consulting. I can tell you these kind of pivots, they do age you a little bit, so I'll stay where I am right now. But it's essentially really about taking the guesswork out of a lot of aspects around revenue and capacity planning. So helping the go-to-market side become more data-driven and more finance literate, and at the same time helping finance better understand the operating mechanics and how the sausage is actually made in go-to-market. So finance people, for example, don't necessarily know what it takes to motivate, a salespeople organization. So now I'll quickly close this. I've helped about 30 plus technology companies, but also in other sectors in kind of the areas where go-to-market and finance meet each other, regardless of whether it's a negotiation or collaboration. And that typically goes into bottoms-up revenue planning, capacity planning, territory allocation, quota design, or quota allocation and compensation design.
That's great. Great to have you. Definitely a need in the market for what you're talking about. I think the predictability on the go-to-market side is so important. Of course, data-driven, key to my heart. But then also, actually, I think you put it really well, showing finance like what it takes to actually like hit numbers. I think I've heard from VPs of sales, CROs of like, finance says we just got to grow 50%, and it's just easy to put into a spreadsheet, but they don't always think about like what actually has to feed the model to do that tactically.
Yeah, and that is one, maybe just quickly touch on that, because if you think about finance skill sets, about 70% perhaps of finance, maybe let's just look at CFOs, right? Maybe 70% of them typically have a controller background, more CPA kind of orientation, which is generally more backward looking. And that means that living in the future is just something, it's a muscle that they don't necessarily have always developed. Then you have FP&A that's typically good at budgeting and forecasting, but analytics and insights is often a weaker spot. And then you have strategic finance, which often is, just considered to be about capital structure but from a go-to-market finance perspective, strategic finance is really important, and it's really about setting up the finance function to proactively support the needs of an evolving go-to-market organization.
Yeah, that's great. Well, let's dive right into capacity planning, Jaap. Let's just start at the highest level for folks that the uninitiated. I'll say, tell me what capacity planning is in a nutshell and why it's so important.
Yeah, no, let's maybe just delineate this a little bit. So we're going to focus really here is on sales capacity planning, or maybe just actually quota capacity planning, right? Because people who are not in sales, but probably CSMs, can also have a quota. And so we leave the marketing out here because marketing just has different drivers, doesn't have the incentive piece, and doesn't necessarily work with quota. So it's best if we skip that, at least for the time being. And so quota capacity planning is kind of like really the most proper way and the most like flexible label also. And it kind of covers all these quota carrying roles. So we're talking about if you really start at the beginning of the funnel, basically, or the bow tie, as we think about it, is think about sales, SDR, BDR, AEs, account management, and then CSMs, and they can be both onboarders, renewal focused, or growth focused. And so a quota capacity model really is a quantitative model that has financial inputs, primarily around compensation and bookings, but also a lot of non-financial stuff, like inputs and outputs that are not necessarily very intuitive. What it does is it helps you plan your revenue growth by using quota performance to forecast bookings and from their revenue.
That's great. Tell me, and this might get into like some of the inputs you just mentioned that were non-quota related, but you made an interesting comment to me in the past around, capacity, quotas, productivity, compensation, all very interconnected, and it's kind of hard to do one without the other. Like, tell me a little bit more about that. Like, why can't you solve one without touching all the others?
So how they're interconnected? Well, in the end, if you just focus on the CRO CFO relationship, it actually doesn't start just with capacity planning. It starts with alignment on revenue goals, right, and on the business goals, and that is kind of a combination of top down and bottoms up information, like historical performance and benchmarks. And so that alignment is really key. Based on the revenue goal, then you look also at what the revenue strategy is going to execute, and how do you what is like the proper sales process, and what kind of roles and responsibilities do you need? So org design comes in there, and that kind of spells out the jobs and or the roles and responsibilities you need, and the management layers you need to have in place, and the overall structure to deliver the revenue plan. And so CROs commit to a revenue plan based on approved sales investments, and those sales investments should be determined based on territory, account, opportunity, potential data, but also understanding really, for example, like about productivity estimates, understanding time allocation, understanding really where there are inefficiencies that can be resolved. So you need really alignment on definitions, metrics, and you need a sufficient amount of accurate opportunity or territory and productivity data in order to size these investments correctly and allocate them in the right places. So capacity planning is really the foundation for other downstream planning processes as well. Territory allocation, which is really about allocating the opportunity to the sales rep, based on which they can perform. And also it reflects, the time and effort required to convert the opportunities that they can work on into actual bookings. And so that then impacts quota setting, because the allocated opportunity should ultimately delineate what quotas should be set at, and also how, what kind of quotas should be set, right? Should it be just bookings, or should it maybe also be logos if you're looking to drive, for example, land and expand? And then quotas ultimately impact the pay performance relationship. Tends to be the place where, at the moment, where finance starts to pay attention. And so the pay performance relationship makes quotas really integral to compensation design. So getting the capacity planning right is actually really key to driving sales effectiveness overall.
Yeah, and so important for just like retention and survivability of the function, right? Like if your productivity math doesn't result in a high enough compensation for reps, good luck recruiting, good luck retaining as well, right? So it's always kind of this triangulation, I imagine.
It is a lot of that. And so it is one of the key issues actually in this kind of work is when, when a company comes to Modern Revenue or to you, come with a problem, is to understand where is actually the source of the problem and to fix things where they're broken. So, I've had situations where people say, our comp plan is broken and we need to fix it so we can increase our win rates. Now, how do we know whether win rates have actually something to do with compensation? Most likely they're not. Win rates can be the function of, a poor process, or it can be, and maybe ultimately originate from issues in first line management. So fixing things where they're broken is really key. And for that, you need data. And to have data, you need alignment.
Yeah. So just to recap, like quota capacity planning in general. So it is effectively understanding how you can hit your bookings or revenue target, and you're working backwards from what is typical productivity for reps over the previous X quarters or X years to understand what is actually reasonable, to then understand headcount, to then understand how you set quota, which then feeds into compensation as well. Is that the right summary there? The goal is like, how do we hit the target for next year? Do we have the right staff in place? How do we compose their book? Is that the right summary?
Yeah, that's kind of, if you really focus it on AEs, things basically get a bit more complicated when you, for example, look at SDRs or you look at CSMs. It's not just about like some bookings number, because these are not hunter roles necessarily. Mm-hmm. And those quotas are also connected. An SDR quota ultimately, or capacity, should be related to the amount of outbound you're looking to drive, and to what extent AEs are, for example, self-sourcing opportunities, right? So these things matter. And one way to look at it is you could do the top line at the top down, of course, right? So you say, okay, here's what we need in revenue, and here's ultimately what it translates to in bookings, and the timing of it, the number of sales reps we needed, and the number of ramped sales rep units we need. But one thing to also really important to understand is actually, what is actually the available productive capacity that you have in a typical kind of role. And this kind of analysis is specifically relevant to roles where, perhaps capacity planning is more based on activity rather than ultimately outcomes. And I'm thinking here specifically about SDRs, like, meetings and opportunities, right? Of course, these, ultimately you need the outcomes. You need the pipeline opportunity, like a sales opportunity that is ultimately transferred to sales and accepted by sales and taken forward. But what is the work that an SDR needs to do in order to actually deliver on their target number of opportunities? And for that, what helps, I think, sometimes is taking a first principle approach that's more bottoms up. Is like, how much time is there actually available in a typical FTE on an annual basis? And a lot of companies completely overlook this. And ultimately, the goal with that is to get to utilization. The starting point is like, a year has 365 days. That's about 250 business days. Then you take out 10 holidays, 240 days. That is then, 20 work days a month. Then you need to actually start to adjust for vacation. And the best way is just to apply that across the board, right? So PTO, maybe 10%, you factor that in. And then there's another important factor that is utilization, as I already mentioned. And that is kind of like every job has a whole bunch of stuff that is not necessarily core to the role, right? It's not necessarily, an SDR should be, doing cold calling, sending out emails, things like that. And I'm talking about the pre-AI era here. But, and ultimately to get to meetings and to opportunities. But how much of that can they actually do in a day? And utilization kind of gives you an idea of, okay, people need to do a whole bunch of admin stuff. People have meetings and town halls, and there's all kinds of other stuff that doesn't necessarily directly translate into opportunities. And what I see typically is like, if all like the companies that I've worked with in my experience is utilization rarely goes above 70%. Which means that if you are making all these adjustments that I just talked about, you have about 5.5 hours a day in which, you can basically, for which you can basically plan all those activities. Now, if you then need to pump out a bunch of emails, like how long does that take? Making calls, booking meetings. And that gives you a nice bottoms-up understanding of those activity-based kind of like roles, or at least that have more of an activity focus. And it's often overlooked. And people misplan or win rates drop. People complain about pipeline, they blame the SDRs, and they blame marketing. And so it's really important then to start looking at, whether that is properly modeled.
Yeah, that's great. I think we touched on AEs at the highest level in the beginning. I think we'll talk a little bit more about that in the later part of the conversation. You touched on SDRs, which is super fascinating, tying the top down approach with the bottoms up approach. Any other nuances from different types of sellers, maybe like AM, for example, that's worth discussing?
Yeah, that is very much so. AMs is actually account managers is actually kind of a bit of a complicated role. But also, let's say this way: once you get post the close win and you actually have an account in the door, the capacity planning gets both easier and it gets harder. It gets easier because you have all the account insight, hopefully, right? You have the relationship, maybe hopefully you have good adoption and usage data, and you have if you're an enterprise and you have a really structured process around renewals, assuming that an AM is also on the hook for gross retention, there's really no reason why you should miss your forecast. But if it gets into expansion, for example, you have a limited universe. Like with an AE, the universe, can probably be expanded. There's some, a little murkiness about like how much opportunity there is in a particular territory. With an AM, it's an assigned book of business. Shifting accounts around in the year, is usually, less ideal and creates lots of friction and distractions. Definitely. And so if you're basically saying, well, we need an NRR, our NRR should be 120% this year, should be improving from whatever level it is at. Okay, for that, we need a certain amount of making sure that we hit our gross retention target, and then we need a certain amount of expansion. Expansion comes in the forms of cross-sell, but also upsell. Upsell, you can have upsell at renewals, which is probably a whole lot easier to do than when you're doing an out-of-cycle upsell. Mm-hmm. And so the key thing here is this is one thing that I always tell my clients, a lot of this is about finding the path that really gives you the visibility into what drives the capacity and then cutting out all the noise. I would say like a lot of what what capacity analysis and capacity modeling involves, especially when you do it for the first time or you have, let's say, doing a new sales motion, for example, a new revenue motion, is about actually figuring out what doesn't matter and just kicking that out of the way and just really focusing on, on the couple of key drivers, and that very much is around booking definitions.
That's a good segue. We can get into booking definitions, but I also wanted to ask, it's kind of related to the things that don't matter. Like, what are the biggest mistakes or blind spots you see leadership teams make when like trying to model capacity?
Boy, but the biggest one really, it actually starts with alignment. People say like, oh, the data is bad, right? Yes, bad data comes from misalignment. It means that the strategic objectives are not properly flushed out, not properly aligned on. There's lack of common definitions, common data model, and also not like a consistent cross-functional planning process. And so that alignment piece starts first. And people think sometimes like, okay, let's get an SPM tool, a sales performance management tool, or other type of technology, or let's hire a bunch of RevOps people so we can figure this out. Or let's make sure that the CRO and the CFO are going on a business trip together where they can bond, right? That's not where alignment starts. It starts with the CEO, or maybe in cases of VC or PE-backed companies with ownership. So then that means like if there's misalignment, there's usually typically insufficient, late, and infrequent planning, which means that you are getting the wrong types of forecasts. So planning is critical. One other thing I see very often is people, like companies change strategy, or they go up markets, they add new revenue motions, they go from perpetual on-prem to SaaS subscription or usage, and they don't make adjustments to org capacity, quota, and compensation. Mm-hmm. And you can really have very regrettable effects already setting in early on in the year, especially if you're an enterprise or maybe federal where you have massive sales cycles. It's very difficult to course correct that once the performance year is ongoing. And so we spoke about not fixing things where they're broken. And then a very huge one, last one I'll mention, this is not accounting for ramp and turnover. Very common. Getting capacity, quota, and compensation wrong drives all of that. And then also hiring, right? Are you hiring enough in order to have enough, boots on the ground in order to hit your plan? And are you doing that early enough? So I would say, and then I mentioned utilization. Those are kind of like the typical things, but there are more.
Yeah, that's a great checklist for sure. Plenty of things to think about. You mentioned misalignment in there as the first or second common mistake. How do different, call it executive personas, CRO, CMO, CFO, CEO, like view this task or problem of capacity planning differently? Like, where do these misalignments happen? I think you mentioned definitions, you mentioned data model. Are these the usual suspects, or are there kind of other things to look out for?
Yeah, well, there is. If we just focus on CRO and CFO, these are very different types of roles and personas and backgrounds. And there's very few, CROs have been finance and vice versa, right? That just rarely happens. And CRO typically, historically at least, was always like CRO delivers growth. They deliver the plan. They want to get paid. They want their salespeople to get paid. And and if RevRec is not easy, then finance has that is a problem for finance to solve. The CFOs at the same time want to hold the line on efficiency, especially in the current environment. More uncertainty, COVID, tariffs, inflation, all of the stuff. And focusing on efficiency, ROI, pay-performance relationship is really important. But the misalignment there often happens is that the CFO says, here's what we need in order to deliver the company plan. The CRO says, here's what I need in order to execute on that. The CRO thinking that the CRO asking for more than the CFO wants to give. And so with efficient growth being, kind of like the MO, neither the CRO or the CFO can do that alone. They need to do it together. So they need to make joint trade-offs. And for that, they need to have common goals, like an end-to-end data model and connected planning. Yeah.
Tell me more about like the end-to-end data model. What does that mean? Maybe call it one layer deeper for folks that aren't sure tactically what to think about like a common data model.
Yeah. So common data model is, if you think about it really about the revenue continuum or the customer journey, it goes all the way from the top of the funnel into strategic finance. So that means that if in strategic finance, they're doing marketing investment planning, or they're helping marketing do that, that means that they're working with marketing related definitions that are not the same, that are not just consistent across marketing and finance, but also across into sales. It also, for example, extends into CSM, because very often if, you're let's say, do top of funnel planning or marketing planning, you're looking for insights about buyers and behaviors and understanding really pain points, etc. A lot of those insights are typically already in your user base, and that user base is overseen by CSMs. So if CSMs then need to talk to marketing, they should be talking about units in terms of definitions and units that both can understand. And ultimately, what it comes down to is like much of go-to-market ultimately is non-GAAP. It's about bookings and it's about operational mechanics. How do you then effectively translate that into the billing piece, into revenue recognition? All these definitions should be connected end to end, but there are also horizontal layers, right? Board level, for example, maybe LTV is adjusted for, like, basically it's more based on discounted cash flow because that's investors think in terms of company valuation. At the finance level, they maybe just look at it, maybe not based on discounted cash flow, but on gross margin. They factor gross margin in. At the marketing side, I've seen LTV decisions or definitions that don't factor in churn. Mm-hmm. And then, then let's look at churn, because churn varies widely by segment, and the benchmarks do as well, right? And then maybe you have a multi-year churn book. So all of these things need to be sufficiently parsed in order for everybody along the customer journey to be able to understand the definitions.
Really helpful. We could probably talk about that for another hour. Sadly, we're coming up on 5, 6, 7 minutes left. So let's talk quickly about like advice on kind of how to execute quota capacity planning in a bit more detail. I think you covered a lot of key themes so far in the conversation. Anything else you add if someone is approaching capacity planning for the first time, like where they should start, like really tactically, if they're going to run this process internally?
Yeah, it starts really, let's say, if you have data, it starts with actually getting like a nice, like clean historical data foundation in place. From, that ultimately can then help you also define common definitions, right? And so generally company data is structured into two pillars. It's customers and employees. So for capacitying, that comes down to having clean CRM data and clean like people or human resources data, specifically around compensation and actual payout. And then you need to look at what are kind of like the productivity drivers from a capacity, assuming that, you have done your work on the revenue planning. Ramp is probably the key one, and it is really a function of so many factors. It depends on, how well you onboard, how well you enable. It depends on sales cycles. So you need to kind of like segment ramp appropriately. And you can do that based on your own historical data. But if you don't have that, let's say 2 or 3 years, there are benchmarks for that as well. But it is very segment and motion specific. And then there are other levers like, total compensation, actually productivity per rep, which is also kind of like the OTE multiple. Like, what is the relationship between the quota that you assign to a rep and the compensation they make? So you should have a good handle on all of those to understand like what is required to deliver the booking plan, what you need in terms of total headcount, kind of like hiring volume, and the kind of fully ramped FTEs that you need to execute.
Yeah, I love it. And I especially agree with just like getting your historical data set in place for so much of the work we do with clients as well. It's like that's step number one, regardless of what type of process or analytics you're running. I think so many companies struggle with this. So I know you spend a lot of time here as well. I think it's absolutely key.
Yeah.
So I know some folks, like when they think about capacity planning, it's kind of what I would call like a messy process. It's maybe done once a year. It's like a little bit ad hoc. It's a little bit... I'm not going to call it finger in the air, but there's not a lot of structure to it. I know you talk about bringing like continuous structure to capacity planning. Like any other tips or things we haven't covered to go from like that messy ad hoc state to like a structured capacity planning muscle?
It is so it requires this kind of like operational understanding of go-to-market and also understanding like how accounting works, right? And it's a key thing here is that ultimately in order to do proper capacity planning and budget allocation, you're gonna need finance on board. You're gonna need to work with finance as a CRO, and that means that finance would need to understand really about what is actually going into these jobs. And actually, there is a bit of a sort of like lateral mover internship kind of like or shadowing process that you could potentially do. If you're finding yourself struggle with, basically convincing finance that you need extra SDRs or AEs or CSMs, invite the CFO to a sales call. Ask someone in finance to actually join an SDR qualification meeting, or join a renewal call, things like that. Those are kind of like, I mean, they're not going to give you like specific data, but at least it widens the aperture of a finance person, and it will be easier then to align on the trade-offs. And so I've repeated it all, like the common definitions, but finding also a way of understanding, basically doing the top-down planning, but also the bottoms-up. And the bottoms-up is about having really accurate or sufficiently accurate opportunity data, but also this kind of available productive capacity piece. I bet you that for example, utilization, most finance and sales leaders don't think about that, and that is already kind of like a blind spot or a gap that if you cover that early on, you're far more set up for success.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, I took a note earlier. You mentioned a common mistake for folks is when they're changing motions, maybe moving up market, they don't change some of their capacity planning or like supporting infrastructure. Like, how do you account from a capacity planning perspective for these different like business motions? It could be PLG, velocity sales and SMB, enterprise. Like, what needs to change? How do you think about these differently?
Yeah, those are often very different, and the customer journey and the buying process, are ultimately the foundation, right? So if you deal with the kind of higher velocity, or maybe self-serve, like PLG, high velocity, typically, for example, you already know, okay, what kind of roles and responsibilities are needed to execute, like basically convert those opportunities into closed won deals and then bookings, right? And what are kind of like the unit economics we can sustain as well. So having a two-stage sales process, for example, with an SDR and an AE doing, like small SMB deals, or PLG, your investors are not going to, and your CFO are not going to be particularly happy with the unit economics, at the end of the quarter or the year. And so define the sales process there and the motions. And then from there, it's about that org design. If you, for example, go up market, that's where things are often just changing. Let's say you're SMB, mid-market, and you're going to go to enterprise. You deal with longer sales cycles, so you need to understand really how that impacts, for example, ramp, right? Because if a rep comes on board, often the ramp period is tight or let's say like significantly connected to the length of the sales cycle. And then it's really difficult to correct these things, especially, when the sales cycles are longer and generally the investment, like cost per rep is higher. Once it is in motion, it's very difficult to correct it in the performance here. So if you're a VC-backed startup with runway limitations, you're a public company that needs to deliver on earning and growth expectations, or you are a PE company on the IRR clock, if you get it wrong at the beginning of the year, you won't really be able to correct it until you get into the next performance year, because making capacity, quota, and compensation changes in year is really, really difficult. And as we know, the hiring takes time. The ramping takes time.
Yeah, well put. Sadly, we're almost out of time. We were basically out of time. Sadly. So one last question for you, Jaap. I think we covered pretty well a lot of the signs that things might not be working well from like capacity planning perspective, like misalignment. I think your example, finance and revenue not being aligned on when a new hire needs to be made is like a great symptom of that. On the flip side, like what's the sign that all of this is working really well?
So very accurate forecasts, and that is, in most cases, it just depends on all of this planning and having proper data and taking the guesswork out of revenue and capacity planning, right? I know, like, for example, if you look at Mark Benioff, I think Mark Benioff is known to be, kind of like having this gut call about like, okay, this is our plan, this is the number of reps we need by that time, and he tends to be right like most of the time. Now, how many Mark Benioffs do we know? I'm only aware of one, and so for those of us who are not Mark Benioff, we need other methods. And so to get to that, if you actually get to high accuracy, that means you're on the right track. Also, compensation actually delivering the outcomes or the strategic behaviors and the strategic outcomes that both the CRO and the CFO had in mind. Because as we talked about earlier, those tend to differ. So were they actually on the same page about what the outcomes should be, and were those outcomes delivered? And in the end, is your sales investment or your sales plan, is it actually self-funding? Because ultimately, with the right allocation of quotas and the right performance distribution, the plan should actually pretty much fund itself. The underperformance should be paying for the overperformers. And then also, are you retaining your reps, right? And then lastly, if there's disagreement, how does it get resolved? Do you need to go up to the CEO, who's not going to be happy to see and solve your problem? Or actually, do you have data that can actually settle the differences? Those are some signs that I would call out.
Really excellent checklist, and it's something everyone should be striving for too. I think that is kind of like the job of RevOps in a nutshell. So I think this was really well put, Jaap. I learned a lot, and I really appreciate you coming on. This was great.
Thanks, James. Really appreciate it, and hope to be back one day.